The conference room in Rotterdam headquarters smelled like burnt coffee and broken dreams. I sat perfectly still while Executive Chair Henrik Vos leaned back in his leather chair, that patronizing smile painted across his weathered face like cheap makeup. The other board members nodded along like trained seals, their faces a unified wall of dismissal. My proposal to streamline shipping operations sat untouched on the mahogany table, 3 months of research gathering dust. Innovation charts, cost projections, and efficiency models that could save the company millions in logistics costs. All ignored because they deemed my ideas too impulsive for serious consideration. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead like angry insects, casting harsh shadows across the polished wood surface. Henrik's gray temples caught the light as he delivered his verdict with theatrical precision. "Gregor, you have potential," he said, his Dutch accent making each word sound like a judicial pronouncement. "But leadership requires seasoning with age. Perhaps in a decade when you've outgrown these rash impulses." The condescension hit me like a physical blow, each word carefully chosen to diminish and dismiss. I was 31 years old, not some fresh college graduate stumbling through his first corporate presentation. I'd been at this global logistics firm for 7 years, watching incompetence get promoted while excellence got patronized. The walls of this conference room had witnessed my victories and defeats, had absorbed my late-night strategies and weekend breakthroughs that consistently delivered results beyond expectations. Meanwhile, my rival Marcel Thorne, 15 years my senior and half as capable, sat smugly at Henrik's right hand. Marcel had just been promoted to Regional Operations Director, the exact position I'd been pursuing. His biggest achievement was not destroying the client relationships I'd built from scratch. The message was crystal clear as mountain air. Experience meant age, not results. Wisdom meant gray hair, not innovation. Success meant conformity to their outdated hierarchies, not disruption of their comfortable mediocrity. The silence stretched like pulled taffy as I gathered my materials with deliberate precision. Every muscle in my body wanted to sweep everything off the table and through those floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Rotterdam harbor. Instead, I organized my papers methodically, each document representing months of analysis they'd dismissed without serious consideration. "Your proposal certainly has merit," Henrik called after me as I reached the glass doors, his voice echoing off the walls. "We'll revisit this when you've had more time to mature professionally." The word mature followed me down the hallway like smoke from a house fire, clinging to my clothes and filling my lungs with toxic humiliation. I pressed my back against the wall outside the conference room and closed my eyes, fighting the urge to return and tell them exactly what I thought of their antiquated leadership philosophy. The worst part wasn't the rejection itself. I'd prepared for that possibility. The worst part was the quarterly review scheduled for this afternoon, where I'd present record-breaking growth numbers that would once again be ignored because they came from someone under 40. My phone buzzed with a reminder that felt like salt in an open wound. Quarterly review presentation, 3 p.m. As head of European logistics coordination, I was expected to showcase the same results they'd just deemed insufficient for advancement. The irony tasted bitter in my mouth, like overbrewed coffee from the break room. Back at my desk, I stared at the presentation that would demonstrate 40% efficiency improvements and cost reductions that exceeded targets by unprecedented margins. HR Director Etta Marlowe cornered me near the elevators after lunch, her smile as fake as Henrik's concern for my professional development. She was one of those corporate climbers who'd mastered the art of saying nothing while appearing deeply invested in your career trajectory. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a severe bun that matched her personality perfectly. "Gregor, I heard about this morning's meeting," she said with theatrical sympathy. "Don't be discouraged. These things take time in our industry." Her tone implied I should be grateful for any attention from the executive level, regardless of how dismissive it had been. "How much time exactly?" I asked, genuinely curious about their timeline for recognizing competence. She laughed, that hollow corporate laugh reserved for uncomfortable questions. "Well, most of our successful leaders didn't reach senior positions until their 40s. Perhaps you should wait your turn for another decade or so." The phrase, "wait your turn," hit me like ice water. as if excellence operated on some cosmic queue system where mediocrity automatically advanced based on calendar years rather than actual performance or strategic thinking. That evening, alone in my office overlooking the harbor lights, something crystallized in my mind with diamond clarity. If they wanted to treat me like an impatient child, I would show them exactly what a grown man's calculated fury could accomplish. I sat in the leather chair that had been my prison for 7 years, watching cargo ships navigate the dark waters below. Each vessel represented millions in revenue that flowed through systems I'd optimized, efficiencies I'd created, relationships I'd cultivated. Yet none of it mattered to the fossils who controlled the corporate hierarchy through nothing more than stubborn longevity. The rage that had been simmering for months finally reached its boiling point. Not the hot, impulsive anger of youth they expected from someone my age, but something colder and more dangerous. The kind of methodical fury that plans 10 moves ahead and leaves nothing to chance. I opened my laptop and began typing notes that would serve as the foundation for their systematic destruction. If they want me to wait my turn, I whispered to the empty office, my reflection ghost-like in the window glass. I'll make sure there are no turns left for them to take. The harbor lights twinkled below like stars, each one representing a connection, a resource, a weapon I could deploy in the war they'd just declared. They thought age equaled wisdom, but they were about to learn that youth combined with intelligence and righteous anger was far more deadly than their comfortable assumptions. I began documenting everything, every slight, every dismissal, every piece of evidence that would prove their incompetence. This wasn't going to be a tantrum or an emotional outburst. This was going to be surgical, precise, and absolutely devastating. The next morning, I arrived at the office 2 hours early, armed with coffee and a detailed plan that would have impressed Sun Tzu himself. My first target was understanding exactly who I was dealing with, their weaknesses, their secrets, their pressure points. Henrik Vos, for all his executive gravitas, had left digital breadcrumbs throughout the company's financial systems that told a fascinating story of questionable offshore consulting arrangements. I spent the following weeks mapping their vulnerabilities with the patience of a master chess player. Henrik's mysterious consulting fees to a Cayman Islands shell company. Edda's habit of steering lucrative contracts toward her cousin's shipping firm in Hamburg. Marcel's educational credentials looked impressive until you actually called the universities listed on his resume. Each discovery was carefully documented and cross-referenced, building a portfolio of corporate malfeasance that would make international headlines. The beauty of being consistently underestimated was that they'd stopped paying attention to my activities entirely. I had access to financial systems I'd helped design years earlier, permissions they'd forgotten I possessed. While they played golf and attended expensive lunches, I was building an arsenal of information that would destroy their carefully constructed professional lives. Late nights became my hunting ground, empty offices my battlefield, and their own arrogance my greatest ally in gathering the ammunition I needed. Building alliances required a different approach than gathering evidence. I couldn't simply reveal what I discovered. That would make me look like a disgruntled employee seeking revenge. Instead, I needed to cultivate genuine relationships with the mid-level managers who'd been equally frustrated by the company's stagnation under incompetent leadership. These were smart, capable professionals who'd watched their innovative ideas die in committee while Henrik's circle promoted each other's mediocrity. Miranda Presser from Singapore Operations was the first to join my informal network. She'd been proposing digital transformation initiatives for 3 years, only to watch them get buried under bureaucratic resistance from executives who barely understood email. Barker James in London had similar frustrations with outdated inventory management systems that cost the company millions in inefficiencies annually. I started hosting informal dinner meetings at upscale restaurants away from company premises, creating spaces where these talented managers could voice their frustrations without fear of corporate retaliation. I listened more than I spoke, validating their concerns while subtly sharing pieces of evidence that supported their suspicions about executive incompetence. By month's end, I had a core group of 15 loyal allies spread across 3 continents, all hungry for change and willing to support someone who understood their vision. The data vault I'd been building contained enough evidence to destroy careers and possibly trigger criminal investigations. But information without context was just ammunition without a weapon. I needed to find the financial smoking gun that would make their corruption undeniable to shareholders and regulators alike. That smoking gun came in the form of deferred investments, a creative accounting technique Henrik had been using to hide massive losses from failed expansion attempts. Over the past 3 years, the company had written off nearly 87 million euros in failed ventures, but these losses had been categorized as strategic investments rather than operational failures. The accounting sleight of hand made quarterly reports look stable while disguising the fact that Henrik's leadership had driven the company toward insolvency. Even more damaging was evidence that he'd personally profited from several of these failed ventures through his consulting arrangements. I spent countless nights in the office, cross-referencing financial records with email communications and board meeting minutes. The pattern of deception was so systematic it bordered on impressive. Henrik had created an entire shadow economy within the company, funneling money through subsidiary agreements and offshore consulting fees, while presenting a facade of steady growth to shareholders. The documentation was meticulous enough to satisfy forensic accountants and international regulators who would inevitably become involved. The quarterly report became my weapon of choice, a Trojan horse that would look perfectly legitimate while containing enough explosive information to trigger immediate board action. I couldn't simply dump everything at once. That would look like sabotage rather than professional analysis. Instead, I crafted a presentation that appeared to celebrate our achievements while including subtle footnotes about unreconciled accounting discrepancies that demanded further investigation. Each slide was carefully constructed to tell 2 stories simultaneously. The surface narrative highlighted our operational successes and efficiency improvements under my coordination. The deeper story, hidden in appendices and technical notes, raised serious questions about financial management and strategic decision-making at the executive level. Anyone with basic accounting knowledge would immediately recognize the red flags I'd embedded throughout the document. I rehearsed the presentation dozens of times, perfecting a delivery style that would appear professionally concerned rather than accusatory. The goal was to let Henrik hang himself with his own responses when questioned about the discrepancies. I prepared follow-up documentation that could be produced upon request, ensuring that every question would lead to more damaging revelations about his leadership failures. The Whisper campaign began with strategic leaks to financial journalists who specialized in corporate malfeasance. I'd cultivated relationships with several investigative reporters over the years, providing them with background information on industry trends and regulatory changes. Now I began sharing anonymous tips about potential accounting irregularities at major logistics firms, without specifically naming our company initially. Within weeks, rumors were circulating throughout the industry about potential fraud investigations involving European shipping conglomerates. Social media amplified these whispers, with former employees from various companies sharing their own experiences with questionable executive behavior. The narrative was building momentum independent of my direct involvement, creating an environment where serious questions about corporate governance would seem inevitable rather than targeted. I also ensured that internal communications began reflecting employee concerns about leadership transparency and strategic direction. Anonymous suggestion boxes started receiving detailed questions about expense reporting and executive compensation. Union representatives in our German operations began asking pointed questions about offshore consulting arrangements. The pressure was building from multiple directions simultaneously, making it impossible for Henrik to identify a single source of opposition while forcing him to respond to increasingly uncomfortable inquiries about his business practices. The board meeting took place on a gray Thursday morning that would forever mark the beginning of Henrik's professional destruction. I entered the conference room with my usual materials and professional demeanor, giving no indication that I was about to detonate a bomb that would reshape the entire company hierarchy. The quarterly presentation proceeded exactly as planned, smooth, professional, and seemingly routine until I reached the financial analysis section. As you can see from slide 23, our operational efficiency has improved significantly, I said, advancing to a chart that looked perfectly normal at first glance. However, I do want to flag some unreconciled accounts that appeared during my analysis. Nothing urgent, but perhaps worth reviewing with our external auditors. The phrase unreconciled accounts hit the room like a lightning strike. causing visible tension among board members who understood its implications. Henrik's face went pale as he realized what I'd just done. Marcel started shuffling papers nervously, suddenly very interested in his coffee cup. Etta attempted to interject with questions about operational details, but the board members were now focused entirely on the financial discrepancies I'd highlighted. Within minutes, the meeting had transformed from a routine quarterly review into an impromptu audit discussion, with several board members demanding immediate access to the detailed documentation I'd so helpfully prepared. Marcel's destruction came swiftly once I'd provided journalists with documentation proving his MBA from London Business School was completely fabricated. The investigation took less than 48 hours, with reporters confirming that no student by his name had ever attended the program he'd claimed as his qualification for promotion to Regional Operations Director. The story broke on a Tuesday morning, with headlines across European business publications questioning how such obvious fraud had escaped detection during the hiring process. The domino effect was immediate and devastating. Marcel's falsified credentials called into question every decision he'd made, every contract he'd negotiated, every strategic initiative he'd championed. Clients began demanding reassurances about the competency of their account management, while competitors started poaching business relationships they assumed were now vulnerable due to leadership instability. Henrik tried to contain the damage by immediately terminating Marcel and launching an internal investigation into hiring practices. But the questions had multiplied beyond his control. How many other executives had fabricated their qualifications? What due diligence processes had failed so catastrophically? Why hadn't anyone verified such basic credentials before promoting someone to a senior position? Marcel's disgrace became a mirror reflecting the incompetence of everyone who'd enabled his rise through the corporate hierarchy. Etta Marlowe's downfall required a more delicate approach, since her nepotism was technically legal but ethically indefensible. The key was demonstrating how her family connections had cost the company millions in inflated contracts while denying opportunities to more qualified competitors. I'd spent months documenting every contract awarded to her cousin's Hamburg-based shipping firm, comparing their pricing and performance to industry standards and alternative providers. The evidence was overwhelming. Over 3 years, Etta had steered nearly 15 million euros in business toward her family's company, despite consistently higher costs and mediocre performance ratings from operational teams. More damaging was email correspondence showing her actively discouraging bids from competitors who could have provided the same services for significantly less money. When this information reached the company's ethics committee through carefully orchestrated leaks to union representatives, the resulting investigation was swift and merciless. Staff members who'd been quietly grumbling about favoritism suddenly had documented proof of their suspicions. The Hamburg contracts became a rallying cry for employees who'd watched qualified vendors get dismissed while inferior services received preferential treatment. Etta's resignation became inevitable once her own HR policies were applied to her conduct, creating a beautiful irony that made her destruction particularly satisfying. Henrik's offshore accounts were the masterpiece of my investigation, a complex web of financial arrangements that demonstrated not just poor judgment, but potentially criminal behavior. The Cayman Islands consulting company he'd established received over 2 million euros annually for strategic advisory services that existed only on paper. Even more damaging was evidence that this same company had been involved in the failed expansion ventures that had cost shareholders tens of millions. The beauty of Henrik's scheme was its sophistication. The tragedy was its sloppiness. He'd left digital fingerprints throughout the company's financial systems, email traces that connected his personal enrichment to strategic decisions that had harmed shareholder value. When international auditors began reviewing these transactions, triggered by anonymous tips I'd provided to regulatory agencies, they discovered a pattern of self-dealing that violated numerous corporate governance standards. The media storm that followed was spectacular. Business journalists across Europe picked up the story of a logistics executive who'd allegedly enriched himself while driving his company toward financial instability. Henrik's reputation, built over decades of careful networking and strategic positioning, crumbled in weeks as more evidence emerged. His attempts to blame subordinates for accounting irregularities only deepened the scandal. making him appear both corrupt and incompetent. The board had no choice but to suspend him pending a complete forensic investigation. The staff revolt was organic and beautiful to witness. Middle managers and rank-and-file employees who'd been quietly frustrated with executive incompetence suddenly found their voice when presented with evidence that validated their suspicions. What started as whispered conversations in break rooms evolved into formal complaints to the Ethics Committee, union grievances, and eventually organized resistance to directives from the discredited leadership. My network of allies across 3 continents became the informal communication system that coordinated this rebellion. Miranda Presser in Singapore started sharing efficiency proposals that had been rejected by Marcel's team. Barker James in London began implementing inventory improvements despite lack of official authorization. Department heads started bypassing Henrik entirely, bringing strategic questions directly to me instead of following traditional hierarchical channels. The transformation was remarkable. A company that had been paralyzed by bureaucratic resistance suddenly became dynamic and responsive. Employees who'd felt voiceless for years began contributing ideas and taking initiative. Productivity increased dramatically as people stopped waiting for permission from executives who'd proven themselves incompetent. Within 6 weeks, I was effectively running daily operations while Henrik desperately tried to maintain his authority from an increasingly empty corner office. The Singapore Investor Summit became Henrik's public execution, though he didn't realize it until I began my presentation to assembled shareholders and financial analysts. The conference room overlooked Marina Bay, a fitting backdrop for the maritime logistics industry's most dramatic corporate scandal. I'd been invited to present our operational improvements, but I prepared something far more comprehensive. Ladies and gentlemen, I began, my voice carrying across the silent room. I want to share some concerning discoveries about financial irregularities that demand immediate board attention. The projection screen filled with charts showing the 87 million euros in hidden losses, offshore consulting arrangements, and systematic accounting manipulation that had disguised the company's true financial position for years. The reaction was immediate and volcanic. Investors who trusted Henrik's leadership began demanding explanations for decisions that had cost them millions while enriching him personally. Pension fund managers started calculating their losses from investments based on fraudulent financial reporting. Regulatory representatives in attendance began taking notes that would trigger formal investigations across multiple jurisdictions. Henrik sat frozen at the conference table, watching his professional legacy collapse in real time as I methodically presented evidence of his systematic betrayal of shareholder trust. Henrik's desperate attempt to sacrifice Etta and Marcel to save his own position backfired spectacularly when I produced evidence linking him directly to every decision they'd made. The email trails I preserved showed him approving Marcel's promotion despite questionable credentials, endorsing Etta's contracting arrangements with her family's company, and personally authorizing the accounting treatments that had hidden massive losses from shareholders. His strategy of claiming ignorance about subordinate misconduct collapsed when journalists published recorded conversations where he discussed these arrangements in detail. The recordings, obtained through completely legal means during board meetings I'd attended, demonstrated his active participation in decision-making processes he now claimed to have known nothing about. The resignation spiral accelerated as board members realized Henrik had compromised their own reputations through association with his schemes. Independent directors began distancing themselves publicly, while major shareholders called for immediate leadership changes. Henrik's attempt to buy time through external consultants and crisis management firms only made the situation worse, as every delay provided more opportunities for additional evidence to surface through ongoing investigations. The media storm reached international proportions when recordings of executive meetings where Henrik and his team had mocked younger employees went viral across social platforms. The conversations, captured during routine board sessions, revealed a corporate culture that was not just incompetent, but actively hostile to talent and innovation. Henrik's voice, clearly identifiable, could be heard dismissing proposals as millennial nonsense and joking about putting young upstarts in their place. The public outrage was swift and merciless. Professional associations began investigating the company's practices, while business schools used the recordings as case studies in toxic leadership. Social media campaigns targeted the company's brand, with customers and partners distancing themselves from an organization that had become synonymous with age discrimination and corporate corruption. The viral nature of the scandal attracted international attention, with news outlets in London, New York, and Hong Kong picking up the story. Henrik's attempt to control the narrative through traditional PR channels failed completely, as social media amplified every damaging detail faster than his crisis management team could respond. The company's reputation, built over decades, was destroyed in a matter of weeks by evidence of systematic prejudice and financial misconduct. The London branch collapse was perhaps my most elegant strategic maneuver, a complex operation that appeared to be market-driven while actually resulting from carefully orchestrated client relationship management. Over several months, I'd been building alternative relationships with key accounts, positioning myself as their primary point of contact, while subtly highlighting the instability created by executive misconduct. When the scandal broke publicly, these clients were already prepared to transition their business elsewhere. The timing appeared coincidental rather than coordinated, making it impossible for anyone to prove deliberate sabotage. Major shipping contracts that had anchored the London operation for years suddenly came up for renewal at the worst possible moment, with clients expressing concerns about working with a company under international investigation. The financial impact was devastating. The London branch lost nearly 60% of its revenue within 6 weeks, forcing emergency cost-cutting measures that made the situation even worse. Henrik's attempts to stabilize operations by offering discounts to remaining clients only accelerated the decline, as competitors used the company's desperate pricing as evidence of financial instability. The branch that had once been profitable became a liability, requiring bailouts from other divisions while generating negative publicity that affected global operations. Henrik's private meeting with me was the sweetest moment of my entire campaign, a complete reversal of the power dynamic that had existed just months earlier. He came to my office, not his, looking haggard and desperate in a way that satisfied something deep in my soul. The man who dismissed my ideas as immature was now begging for my help in saving his career and the company he'd nearly destroyed through incompetence and greed. "Gregor, I need your help," he said, his voice lacking the commanding tone he'd used to humiliate me in countless meetings. "You understand the operations better than anyone. You could help stabilize things until this investigation concludes." The irony was delicious. The same person he'd deemed too young for leadership was now his only hope for survival. I leaned back in my chair, the same chair where I'd planned his destruction, and smiled with genuine amusement. "Henrik, I appreciate you coming to me with this request, but I seem to remember you telling me I was too impulsive, too immature, that I needed to wait my turn for another decade." His face crumpled as he realized I was throwing his own words back at him. "I'm still too young to lead, remember? Perhaps you should find someone more seasoned to handle these complex challenges." The board's emergency vote was unanimous and swift. Henrik's resignation was formally accepted, along with that of the remaining executive committee members who'd enabled his mismanagement. Etta had already departed in disgrace. Marcel's fabricated credentials had made him unemployable in the industry, and the other senior leaders had either resigned preemptively or been terminated for their complicity in the financial irregularities. I was offered interim control of the company pending a comprehensive search for permanent leadership, a search that everyone understood was mere formality given my role in exposing the corruption and stabilizing operations during the crisis. At 31, I was about to become the youngest CEO in the company's history. Exactly the outcome Henrik had insisted was impossible due to my supposed lack of maturity and experience. The announcement was made at a company-wide meeting in Rotterdam headquarters, with video connections to London and Singapore offices. As I walked to the podium where Henrik had once delivered his patronizing dismissals, I felt the weight of vindication and the satisfaction of justice finally served. The employees who'd watched me be consistently undervalued were now witnessing my elevation to ultimate authority over the people who'd dismissed me. The executive purge was comprehensive and merciless. Every manager who'd participated in the old system of age-based discrimination and incompetence-enabled advancement found themselves facing immediate performance reviews and restructuring decisions. I replaced Henrik's cronies with the hungry, overlooked talent I'd been cultivating. Miranda Presser became regional director for Asia-Pacific. Barker James took control of European operations, and other allies were promoted to positions that matched their abilities rather than their birth years. The transformation was immediate and dramatic. Departments that had been stagnant under elderly, incompetent leadership suddenly became dynamic and innovative. Proposals that had been buried for years were implemented within weeks, generating immediate improvements in efficiency and profitability. The company culture shifted from protecting mediocrity to rewarding excellence, from respecting age to respecting results. Most satisfying was watching former executives try to find new positions in an industry where everyone now knew their story. Henrik's name had become synonymous with corporate fraud. Marcel couldn't work anywhere that required honest credentials, and Edda's nepotism scandal had made her unemployable in any role involving vendor management. They'd spent decades building reputations that I'd destroyed in months, using nothing but their own documented behavior and poor decisions. The public speech I delivered at the International Logistics Leadership Conference became viral content across professional networks and social media platforms. Standing at the podium in Amsterdam's premier conference center, addressing industry leaders from around the world, I spoke directly about the systemic age discrimination that had nearly destroyed our company and countless others like it. Merit has no expiration date, and innovation knows no age limit. I declared to an audience of executives who represented the same prejudices that had held me back for years. The biggest risk to our industry isn't market volatility or regulatory changes. It's the stubborn refusal to recognize talent when it doesn't match outdated assumptions about leadership and experience. The speech was viewed over 3 million times in the first week, with clips shared across LinkedIn, Twitter, and industry publications. Business schools began using excerpts in their leadership curricula, while HR professionals cited my examples of age bias in their diversity and inclusion training programs. The presentation became a manifesto for younger professionals who'd faced similar discrimination, turning my personal revenge into a broader movement for corporate cultural change. Henrik's final humiliation was systematic and complete, the deliberate erasure of his legacy from company history. Every building named after him was redesignated. Every award with his name was melted down and recast. Every photograph of his tenure was removed from corporate displays and archived materials. His contributions to the company's growth were recontextualized as team achievements that had succeeded despite his leadership rather than because of it. The company's official history was rewritten to reflect the true sources of innovation and growth during his tenure. The younger managers and operational teams whose work had been attributed to executive vision. Annual reports were amended to correct misleading narratives about strategic direction and leadership effectiveness. Even the corporate website was scrubbed of references to his achievements, with his biography reduced to a single line noting his departure due to financial irregularities. Most devastating was the industry's complete rejection of his attempts at rehabilitation. Speaking engagements were canceled, board positions were withdrawn, and consulting opportunities evaporated as his reputation became permanently associated with fraud and incompetence. The man who'd built his identity around corporate prestige and executive authority found himself completely exiled from the business world he'd once dominated. I sat in the CEO's chair in Rotterdam headquarters, overlooking the harbor where ships from around the world carried cargo coordinated through systems I'd now designed and implemented. The corner office that had once been Henrik's fortress of executive privilege was now my command center for a company transformed by merit-based leadership and innovative thinking. At 31, I controlled operations across 3 continents and managed relationships with clients who valued results over resume age. The reflection in the floor-to-ceiling windows showed a young executive who'd refused to accept limitations imposed by others' prejudices and assumptions. Every strategic decision I made validated the board's confidence in promoting talent over tenure, innovation over tradition. The company's financial performance had improved dramatically under leadership that prioritized competence and creativity rather than comfortable mediocrity and age-based hierarchy. They told me to wait my turn, I said quietly to the empty office, my voice echoing off walls that had once witnessed my humiliation and now housed my triumph. I didn't wait. I took it. The harbor lights twinkled below like conquered territories, each one representing a connection, a client, a victory in the war against systematic underestimation. They'd wanted me to be patient, to accept their timeline for advancement, to respect their authority based on nothing more than accumulated years. Instead, I'd shown them that youth combined with intelligence, determination, and strategic thinking was far more powerful than their assumptions about experience and wisdom. The crown was mine, earned through their own failures and my refusal to accept their limitations.